The member from Parliament Norfolk.
Good morning, Speaker. To the Premier, your government announced on Tuesday that it's asking for a comment on an 80% reduction of neonicotinoid pesticides by 2017. Now, the grain farmers of Ontario project this ban will cost them $630 million a year. Well, Health Canada has said there is no conclusive scientific evidence that this ban will cut bee mortality rates. Your government said it would only take action if there was conclusive scientific evidence that neonics are a problem, yet in a scrum yesterday, your Minister of the Environment said, and I quote, "All of the science is inconclusive." Premier, why are you cutting neonics by 80% and hurting farmers without the conclusive research evidence necessary to back it up?
Question. Thank you, Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member opposite for the question. This is a very important issue. Of course, it is important to our grain and oilseed farmers, Mr. Speaker. It is important for beekeepers across the province. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a much greater issue here. There is a much greater issue at stake here, Mr. Speaker, and that is the health of pollinators across the province and, quite frankly, across the country, and the ability for us to have a healthy ecosystem. And so, Mr. Speaker, what I said, beginning when I was Minister of Agriculture and Food, and what I continue to say is that we need to make sure that we take the competing interests, because there are competing interests, and we act in the context of the greatest interest, which is that we have a healthy ecosystem and that we preserve that ecosystem for our children and our grandchildren, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Well, we do both agree there is an issue with bee health and mortality in Ontario. In fact, you took the initiative, you created the Bee Health Working Group to study the problem, and when the group reported, they didn't recommend a ban, they didn't recommend a reduction of neonics. What they did recommend were new best practices for using neonics during planting, because the planting process is when the insecticide can be transferred through airborne dust. Those recommendations were acted on during planting last spring, for example, the use of dust-reducing lubricant. And as a result, we are told bee deaths were cut by 70%. Premier, farmers are doing their part to cut bee mortality. Why punish them for the progress they have achieved?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, and I know that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change will want to speak to this, but let me just say that we know that Ontario's economy is driven by a strong agricultural sector. The sector relies on pollinators to be productive, Mr. Speaker, and so we have worked with the Bee Working Group,
Order,
Mr. Speaker.
please.
The reality is that best practices do point to a reduction in the use of neonicotinoids, Mr. Speaker, and that is what we're doing. What we're saying is that we have set an aspirational target to reduce the use of neonicotinoid-treated corn and soybean seed by 80% by 2017. So we are not proposing a ban, Mr. Speaker. We are proposing a reduction. We are proposing a different way of using this pesticide. So we are working very hard to achieve an overwinter honeybee mortality rate of 15% by 2020. That is our target, Mr. Speaker.
Final supplementary. The member from Huron-Bruce.
Back to the Premier. I used to work for OMAFR's Premier. I remember the extensive pest management training. I remember the efforts that went into educating and encouraging farmers to embrace conservation tillage. Today in 2014, Premier, farmers are doing their best. It's the norm for them to have environmental farm plans. You should know that as a former Minister of Agriculture. Ontario farmers are outstanding environmental stewards.
Order, please.
And now seemingly you're asking them to go back in time, using conventional tillage practices and pesticides that are more harmful to the environment. So, Premier, going backwards is not an option for Ontario farmers. So I ask you today, what is the alternative practice that you're going to encourage them?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the member opposite, what is the alternative if we lose our pollinators? And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, that we are going to work with the farmers. I have had many conversations with the head of the grain and oilseed farmers, Mr. Speaker. I understand the concerns, and I have committed to continue to work with them. We have set some aspirational targets to change the practice.
That'll do. Don't worry, I'll get down to the individual. Finish, please.
We have set some aspirational targets, Mr. Speaker. There is time to continue to work with the farmers. They know that. I've had person-to-person conversations with them. I will be meeting many of them tomorrow, Mr. Speaker. But the practices do need to change, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to work with them to make sure that they do.
Thank you. New question, the member from Prince Edward Hastings.
Morning.